Dr. William Masters at the Masters and Johnson Institute, and that's sort of my claim to fame. And what Dr. Masters developed, he was an OBGYN and a researcher, and what he researched and found was that sex is a natural function. We are born with the ability to function, just like we are born with the ability to breathe, hopefully, blink, etc. But along the way, with that capacity to function, sometimes there's a roadblock that interferes with that ability. So this is the sexual response cycle, and this is a very traditional sexual response cycle. There are more contemporary versions, but as I understand MS, I wanted to break it down into the different responses and the different ways that MS has an effect on our ability to respond. So we've got arousal, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. We know that there are two basic physiological processes that are going on. We have vasocongestion, which is the swelling, and also the engorgement. So like the erection and the labia, that swelling that occurs. And then we've got myotonia, which is the increase of energy and tension in the nerves and muscles, that sort of tensing and the contraction, oftentimes related to orgasm. So along the way, our sexual response is definitely mediated, obviously, by the brain and the spinal cord. And along the way, oftentimes with an MS diagnosis, there are sexual dysfunctions related, specific to the different phases of sexual arousal and response. When talking about the arousal phase, that's a very beginning. Arousal is a response to a sexual stimuli. With MS, we get tired. Medications may interfere with our ability to really feel that arousal. For men, it looks like the gradual engorgement, and for women, it's the gradual swelling and lubrication process. Then we go to plateau. So we've got a sexual stimulation or a sexual stimuli, a response, our body begins, and then we reach a point where if we continue feeling good, orgasm will be inevitable. For men, at a certain point, whether they're being touched or stimulated or not, there is an ejaculatory response if we're looking at a typical arousal process. So at a certain point, no matter how many different ways you think about the cardinal space ball, you're still going to have an ejaculation. For women, it's different. Women require stimulation up until the point of orgasm. So the most subtle or slight move can create a process that keeps you sort of in that plateau. And so for a lot of people with MS, that difficulty with concentration and sustaining that mindful way of being with your body and pleasure can interfere with plateau and can interfere with the orgasmic response. Obviously, that fear of losing control over bladder keeps a lot of people in their head and prevents an orgasm from occurring as well. Now again, orgasm is not the end-all be-all, but we're looking at the sexual response cycle and the phases. Welcome to orgasm. So it's a release of neuromuscular tension. For women, there are rhythmic contractions in the uterus and the vagina and the anus. For men, there's an emission often, but for some, there's a retrograde ejaculatory response where nothing comes out, but there are still contractions. But for a lot of people, there's a complete loss of sensation, a loss of orgasm, or those orgasms that used to feel like a roller coaster ride now feel like the log flume without the big dip. Or I should say, yes. So when looking at the orgasmic response, I sort of look at that on a continuum. A typical orgasmic dysfunction is primary. I've never had an orgasm. I have no idea what one feels like. People have talked about it. And boy, I'd really like one. Secondary is I used to have them, and now I don't. And oftentimes that's what we see with a diagnosis of MS. So I used to have them, and now I don't. And then primary is another pretty common dysfunction. Primary, secondary, and then situational. That's what I mean. Situational meaning I can with a vibrator, or I can with clitoral stimulation, but I'm not able to with penetration. And that's pretty typical, but oftentimes when sensation has been decreased, we need a little bit more in order to get to the desired result. And then we've got the resolution phase. Resolution meaning we are back to our pre-aroused state. And for some, that doesn't happen. And that's called persistent genital arousal. And with persistent genital arousal, it's painful. I mean, you know, one may think to stay aroused all the time could be sort of cool. It's not cool at all. It's actually painful and quite frustrating. And an orgasm does not promote a resolution for them, so that swelling and becomes an ache and then a pain. And there's oftentimes some spasticity related to that, but overall, it requires oftentimes a medical intervention. All right, so Mary Kay talked about primary changes, secondary changes, and tertiary changes. Let's talk about what we can do. Obviously, communication is the number one recommendation I'm going to make. When I say communication, what I mean is don't wait until the very last minute of your appointment with your physician or the nurse practitioner when her or his hand is on the door and they're getting ready to leave and you finally get enough courage to ask a question. Make an appointment where that is the focus. Many physicians are not anywhere near as comfortable as one would expect them to be. But if you're comfortable and say, I appreciate that you may not have all the answers, but I need to know a place to start, that will hopefully, I know in this group with these physicians, they will be more than comfortable and competent to answer these questions. But you may have had an experience where you tried to bring it up with your physician and they were really uncomfortable about it and not maybe feeling awkward. And you know, I suggest that you try again, because it is important to be able to have an interaction and a dialogue with your physician so that you can find out and be prepared for side effects of medications. Symptoms that you may have questions about, they have heard it all, and if my hope is, I do a lot of training for the residents. My hope is, because I've been teaching them to say this, you know what, it's a really important question, I don't know the answer, but I'll find out and get back to you. So my hope is that at the very least that's what you'll get, so that you can be put in the direction of somebody that may have some information. There's an organization, I'm going to say it right now so I don't forget, called ASECT, American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. This is a credentialing board, and there's a pretty strict criteria that needs to be met in order to call yourself a certified sex therapist. Anybody can call themselves a sex therapist, but to be certified through ASECT means that they've gone through the necessary criteria to earn the right to call themselves a sex therapist. So that way you're not getting some sort of weird, creepy, uneducated person that just wants to be a sex therapist, so advertises as such. This is oftentimes a licensed professional, whether it's a nurse, a social worker, a counselor, a psychologist. Often, some MDs are actually a part of this. So when talking about managing sexual changes, let's talk for a minute about decreased or changed genital sensations. Sometimes you have to create a new normal, and what that means is what used to feel really good may no longer feel good. It may be that now you're more aroused near your bottom area and no longer your genital area. Maybe your knees feel good. More vigorous oral stimulation and mechanical vibrators. I'm going to show you guys some pictures. I want to warn you now not to feel awkward or uncomfortable if you want to leave, but some of what I'm going to talk about may be beyond what's comfortable for you. So I will not be offended if you feel like, you know, this is more than I ever needed to see. Thank you so much, and I'll call for questions later. But I just sort of want to warn you that some of this may be beyond what's comfortable for you, but I feel like for many of you, it's a relief to be able to listen to some alternatives and some ideas on how to increase arousal in an erotic experience. And, you know, we talk about bowel and bladder control. We talk about diet and exercise, but we don't talk so much about what we can do when we'd like to have an orgasm and we're no longer able. So I've got some good ideas and I'd like to share them with you. Welcome to the sexual assistive device. Now these, for me, I call them vibrators. They don't look like big, purple, phallic-looking things that would be uncomfortable if your granddaughter or your son were to find them under your bed. These are like back massagers. Now some of the other ones that you can insert have the ability to promote pelvic floor, like tone and Kegel exercises. Others are really just for external stimulation, and some just feel good and they go in deep and they stimulate areas both anally and vaginally that you may or may not want stimulated. In this case, sexual assistive devices almost becomes of medical necessity instead of, oh, that's a little freaky, I'm not quite sure. But for many people, they need an more intense level of stimulation than their partner or they're able to promote. And this is a great way to adjunct or assist in promoting more stimulation. All right, so then we're talking about lowered libido. We all go through opportunity where we'd rather choose sleep over sex, or it becomes something that goes on our to-do list. And in the world of having a diagnosis of MS, it's no different. However, there are medications, I think, that affect libido, and oftentimes transitioning into being a caregiver or being taken care of can affect libido, body image, etc. What can we do about it? Well, there are body map exercises. I'm going to show you an example of what a body map exercise is. In order to facilitate conversation, sensate focus exercises, date night Kegel exercises in order to strengthen the pelvic floor, but really figuring out what feels good for self so that you can communicate with your partner. That's always going to be my primary recommendation. It's okay to touch yourself. It's okay to explore. Go on that journey so that you can report back if you're in a relationship with your partner and you can have a conversation. You know, I really used to like when you did that one thing with your tongue, but I don't like that anymore. So the purpose of the body map is first to explore yourself and to figure that out. It's sort of like a research project or an investigation. And then, hopefully, it will enhance your own awareness and allow for you the opportunity and the comfort to facilitate a conversation with your partner. So the guidelines of this are you're alone at first because, again, it's a bit intimidating if someone's watching over you. You're not a research project in a lab like the Masters and Johnson model, but being alone, creating a safe environment, you have to do this a couple of times, and you have to pay attention to those sensations so that you can document. This is what an example of a body map looks like. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Thumbs up, this is what I noticed I really like. Thumbs down, not so much. And then you have the ability in your play to use this as a way to facilitate conversation. That one time when you did that, I really liked it. I'm not quite sure, but it was around this area. So even this benign map of a pretty gender neutral version of body has the ability to be used with both. So you both can do a little bit of an assignment and report back. Then we've got sensate focus. Pardon this slide, I'm not quite sure what happened. A lot of information. Sensate focus is something that Dr. Masters, actually Virginia Johnson was a great asset. Dr. Masters was a researcher and he was he created a medical model. And Virginia Johnson sort of added the sweet, special, softer version of the real Masters and Johnson, the treatment protocol. Sensate focus is a graduating amount of sensual exercises, sensual touch exercises that focus on temperature, texture, and pressure, not performance. So at first you take genitals off the table. We're not going anywhere near. We're going to focus on all different aspects, the difference in feeling behind the ear versus the elbow, and then over time you add more genital touch. And the experience, you have a sender and then you have a receiver, and that experience helps build both communication verbally and non-verbally. But what's really important is the ability to be able to relax. You cannot have an orgasm if you're not, an erection if you're not relaxed. So one would think if you focus really hard and you think about it like you can work to get an erection. It doesn't work like that. Actually, that will chase the erection away and decrease blood flow. And my recommendation, I do not work much with injections or vacuum assistive devices, but those are options. Vaginal dryness is definitely an issue for most of us, but I think with regard to sexual play, whether you have vaginal dryness or not, lubrication is really quite helpful. Slippery equals pleasure, and it also increases and improves circulation. And if we are dry, that friction can really be uncomfortable. It can also help if you need to use a condom. It can help increase pleasure. So there are different types of lubricant. We've got water-based and we've got silicone-based. But what I want to remind you of is With certain lubrications, one issue would be, the ones that are being offered and thought of as pleasure-enhancing lubricants. KY has this pleasure-enhancing series. All of those have a numbing ingredient, and what numbs the penis or the vagina is going to decrease sensation, right? So that sort of menthol feeling can also create a burning heat sensation that for many does not feel good. Also, some of the lubricants and some of the oral gels have sugar in them, and sugar in a wet, warm, dark area has the potential to promote yeast. And yeast, there's nothing sexy about a yeast infection. So there's water-based and then there's silicone-based. And with silicone, a little goes a long way, and the only problem with that is you can't use it with toys, with silicone toys, because it will eat that material. When talking about coping with spasticity, again, I often defer and refer to physical therapy, but there are alternate positions that may have the ability to help. Like an example would be if you're having a difficult time straightening your legs, maybe you use a chair, but also with weakness, you may not be able to get into the desired position that you once were able to get into, and there are ways around that. All right, when talking about bladder dysfunction, again, I'm going to defer a bit, but there are specific medications that you can take when you're anticipating sexual play, sometimes restricting some fluid intake, knowing and planning for play. Spontaneity is not the answer. In fact, no matter what, whether you have a diagnosis of MS, or if you are in a long-term monogamous relationship, or even an open relationship, spontaneity cannot work. You have to plan and prepare, and that means coming with your accessories, coming with, if we're talking about protection, but also planning for, in this case, managing bladder symptoms. Also, sometimes men can wear a condom for a small amount of leakage if they're worried about that. Fatigue, for some of us, we're never not tired. But for others, we notice that there's a time during the day when we have a little bit more energy, and planning for play around when we are at our most energized can be helpful. Also, if we've been on our feet all day, we may not have the amount of energy that we had, so different sexual positions may be necessary. And then talking about coping with changes in our attention and our concentration. Obviously, when we are tired and fatigued, we are less able to stay focused, but managing our environment and using fantasy can be quite helpful. So I want to talk about fantasy for a second. We get to be whoever we want when we fantasize. So you may want to be in a rock and roll band. Some women may want to have a different partner. There are all different ways that you can create sexual fantasy to be sexual with yourself and also to share that fantasy with your partner. It's completely normal and necessary in order to maintain the arousal, in order to respond to the sexual stimuli. Many of us have sort of a numbing or a dull version, and to add a little bit of fantasy, whether it's through reading an erotic story or creating an erotic story with your partner, that can really promote new and novel opportunity. And novelty and creativity are what help spark the erotic energy. And so if we've got concentration issues, maybe building on a story or reading an erotic story can help keep you from focusing on the grocery list and who needs to pick up who at what time. All right, so in talking about mood, I'm a social worker by trade, so I see a lot of people that have symptoms of depression and anxiety. There are medications that sometimes can manage that, but those same medications do cause some sexual side effects for many, not all. Sometimes they go away, but sometimes they don't. Oftentimes with depression and anxiety, our libido decreases anyway, and yet it's unfortunate because what treats the depression and anxiety oftentimes makes it more difficult and oftentimes affects libido as well. As we sort of go through our own developmental milestones and our own rites of passage as parents and also as people who have a diagnosis, it's really quite helpful to be around people that are going through the same thing and that have maybe done some troubleshooting already. So I think there is something quite special and magical about being in a supportive environment with people that are going through the same thing. And the changing roles has a lot to do with how you end up seeing yourself. And if you look at and visualize being a caregiver or a caretaker, that minimizes your ability to find a new sexual normal. So my recommendation would be to have discussions about when you want to turn on and create an environment that will have an opportunity or will increase the likelihood of that happening, which means a lot of hard work, a lot of focused attention on creating and carving out space for a sexual self. It's important, and it does increase overall quality of life. So for people that may have missed their sex education or didn't get the right kind of sex education, maybe it was the menstrual cycle or masturbation is unhealthy and you may grow a little bit of hair on your palms. Everybody comes from a very different world as it relates to sexual education. Some of us have had a lot, some of us haven't had much at all. Some of us get creative in how we go about getting it, but we're getting misinformed, like from pornography, etc. So my recommendation is for people that are visual learners, some of us are auditory learners, and some of us are visual learners. And so for the visual learner, there are specific videos, CDs, videos, DVDs, I'm so old school, I'm saying video. There are specific sets of educational DVDs that have the ability to show you when you're learning about your body in a way that is not pornographic, but it is definitely graphic. You're going to see genitals and you're going to see people partnering up, and you will learn technique. Thank you, guys.